Rain on the window, a suitcase by the door. You said you'd build a future, but I don't hear from you no more. I was 7, I was small, but I remember every word. When I'm someone, I'll return the promise.
She fired her own father, and he didn't even know it was her until it was too late. 20 years ago, this man left his 7-year-old daughter crying at an airport gate and told her he'd come back when he became someone. He never did. So she became someone instead, and bought his company right out from under him. What happens in the next 15 minutes is one of the coldest, most satisfying reckonings you'll ever watch. Stay till the end, because the moment she takes off her sunglasses in that boardroom changes everything. Nobody in that boardroom knew who she was. But in 20 minutes, they would never forget her name. Kang Min-jae adjusted his tie for the 3rd time that morning, unaware that the biggest deal of his career was about to become the biggest reckoning of his life. Word had spread through the office that the new majority shareholder was flying in personally, a rare move for someone who had, until now, only ever been a name on paperwork. Nobody had seen her face. Nobody knew her story. All anyone knew was that she now owned 51% of the company Min-jae had spent 2 decades building from nothing. The elevator doors opened at exactly 9 o'clock. She walked in wearing black, unhurried, her heels striking the marble floor like a countdown. Every executive at that table rose to their feet out of instinct before they even understood why. There was something about the way she carried herself, calm, deliberate, untouchable, that made the room feel smaller the moment she entered it. She didn't come for revenge. Not really. She came for what had always been owed to her. Backhand index pointing right. If you love stories about quiet justice, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't beg, just simply arrives, hit subscribe right now before we go back to where this all began. Because 20 years ago, this woman wasn't a CEO. She was a little girl standing at an airport gate, crying, begging her father not to leave. Her name was Ha-Eun, and back then, her world was small but whole. Her father, Kang Min-jae, worked long hours as a mid-level manager, chasing a dream that never seemed to arrive fast enough. Her mother stitched garments late into the night in a rented apartment in Incheon, humming softly to keep her daughter's fears at bay whenever the electricity bill ran late. They didn't have much. But they had each other, and to a 7-year-old, that had always felt like enough. Then, one rainy evening, a wealthy investor from Seoul offered Min-jae something he had chased his entire adult life, a partnership. A real company. A real future. But there was a condition attached to that dream, quiet and cruel in the way it was delivered. He had to come alone. Unburdened. Free of distraction. Free, in other words, of them. Ha-Eun remembers that night more clearly than she remembers most of her childhood. Her father standing by the door, suitcase in hand, refusing to meet her eyes. "Appa, are you coming back?" she asked him, her small hand gripping the hem of his coat. He knelt down, just for a moment, and said the words that would haunt both of them for the next 20 years. "I have to build something for us. When I'm someone, I'll come back for you." He never did come back. Not for her 8th birthday, or her 12th, or her 16th. Not when her mother grew sick from exhaustion and years of carrying a household alone. Not even when her mother passed away, quietly, in a hospital bed with no one but a 16-year-old Ha-Eun beside her. There was no anger in Ha-Eun's grief. Just a resolve that hardened into something unbreakable. Standing at her mother's grave, she made herself a single promise, that she would never again build her life around someone else's return. She would become someone entirely on her own terms, so complete in herself that no one's absence could ever break her again. She buried herself in books. In scholarships. In part-time jobs that paid barely enough to survive but taught her the discipline that would define the rest of her life. By the time she was 26, she held an MBA from Wharton and a reputation on Wall Street that made grown men in expensive suits nervous, a reputation for walking into failing companies and rebuilding them from the studs up, without sentiment, without apology. Then, on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, a name from her past crossed her desk in a routine acquisitions report. Kang Industries. Struggling. Bleeding cash. Actively seeking a buyer. She read the name twice before she allowed herself to feel anything about it. And then she picked up the phone. She didn't approach the deal as Ha-Eun, the daughter Kang Min-jae had left behind at that airport gate 2 decades earlier. She approached it as Diane Cole, founder of Cole Capital Partners, a name with no history attached to it, no memories, nothing her father could recognize. The negotiation room in Seoul was tense the day they finally met, though Min Jae had no idea just how tense it truly was. He looked older than she remembered. Tired in a way that numbers on a balance sheet couldn't fully explain. "Miss Cole, thank you for considering our company," he said, sliding a folder of financials across the table, his voice carrying the practiced humility of a man who had learned, painfully, what desperation sounds like. "We've built something special here, even if the numbers don't show it right now." "I don't invest in numbers, Mr. Kong," she replied, her voice steady, giving nothing away. "I invest in what a company could become under the right ownership." He had no idea he was negotiating with the very daughter he'd left crying at that gate. He signed the papers 3 weeks later, his hand trembling slightly as he handed over 51% of everything he'd built, everything he had chosen, 20 years earlier, over her. That night, alone in her hotel suite overlooking the city that had once been her home, Ha-Eun allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel something other than control. She took out an old photograph, herself at 7 years old, her father's arm around her shoulder, taken before everything changed. She told herself this was only business. But some quiet, unhealed part of her needed him to know exactly who had taken his company. Needed him to feel, even briefly, what it was like to lose something he thought was permanently his. Fire this is the moment everything changes. Comment justice below if you think she should reveal herself right now, or make him suffer a little longer first. Ha-Eun requested only one thing for her first official meeting as majority owner, that Kang Min-jae personally present the company's 5-year turnaround plan to her directly. He stood at the head of that boardroom, sweat gathering faintly at his temple, and spoke about loyalty. About legacy. About building something meaningful to pass down to the next generation. He didn't know that the next generation was sitting 3 seats down from him, sunglasses still on, listening to every word land like a small, precise wound. When he finished speaking, she slowly removed her sunglasses. The room fell silent in a way that boardrooms rarely do. "Family legacy," she said, her voice quiet but unmistakably sharp. "Interesting choice of words, Mr. Kong, for a man who left his only child at an airport gate 20 years ago." His pen slipped from his fingers. The color drained from his face as recognition finally settled in, slow and devastating. "Ha-Eun. You said when you became someone, you'd come back for me," she continued. "You never did. So I decided to come back for you instead. As your boss." 20 years of guilt, ambition, and absence collapsed into that single, unbearable moment, and neither of them said another word for a long time. Later that night, he waited outside her office, unwilling to leave without saying what he'd carried silently for 2 decades. When she finally stepped out, he spoke first. "I looked for you," he said. "After your mother passed, I tried. But you had already changed your name, moved on, disappeared from every record I searched. I convinced myself, eventually, that you were better off without me." "A 7-year-old doesn't need a father who's successful," she answered, her voice steady but no longer as cold as it had been that morning. "She needs a father who stays." He had no answer for that. There wasn't one that could undo 20 years of silence. She placed a folder on the table between them, not termination papers, as he likely expected, but a restructuring plan that kept him on as an advisor. Stripped of control, but not entirely stripped of purpose. "I'm not here to destroy what you built, Appa," she said quietly. "I'm here to make sure it finally means something. You'll stay, as an advisor. Nothing more. And you'll watch me build what you should have built beside me, all those years ago." It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, maybe not ever. But it was something harder and more honest than forgiveness, a daughter choosing to make peace with an old wound by refusing to let it define the rest of her story. Under her leadership, Kong Industries didn't just survive. It became the very thing her father had once promised her it would be, 20 years too late, something finally worth coming home to. She never got the childhood she was owed. But she built, with her own hands, the one thing her father never could, a legacy that didn't require anyone's absence in order to succeed. Red Heart, if this story moved you, drop a comment telling us what you'd have done in her position, and subscribe for more powerful stories of survival, success, and quiet justice every week.